to another edition of On the Trail of Delusion, where I try to separate the wheat from the chaff and give you something substantial on the JFK assassination as opposed to the usual nonsense you see on the internet. But today we're in for something a little bit different. My guest is John-Paul Pagano, who is a writer who specializes in extremism in politics, and in particular conspiracy theory, conspiracism, and he's written an awful lot about anti-Semitism. And I thought this would be important for my viewers to understand some concepts about conspiracy theory and where it all comes from. And then hopefully we could all apply it to the JFK assassination. So welcome, John-Paul. And I guess my first question is, please tell us a bit about your research and your interest in conspiracy theory and conspiracism.
Sure. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. I am a writer. I've been at this, I guess you could say, you could clock it at about 25 years now, pretty close to that. I write about extremism in politics, and I've always had a particular interest in writing about conspiracy theories and conspiracism. I don't know how to account for that in elevator terms for your viewers. I think where it comes from is probably just an innate sense that that conspiracism is at the heart of so many political pathologies and so much extremism, and close to so many historical calamities that I began to look into it. I just instinctively, it seemed to me to be at the time when I began, when I first began to look into it, it seemed like it was an relatively undercovered topic area. I felt like, there was a lot of academic work on it, and there were like some of the big books were out there, like Paranoid Style or what have you. But I felt like there was something missing. And so I began to delve into it. And I think I began to drift in the direction of realizing how coextensive conspiracism as a mentality was with anti-Semitism as a mentality.
Right.
I really, I mean, one of the loose off-the-cuff definitions of conspiracy theories is it's a narrative wherein an evil elite, secretly seeks to enslave and exploit humankind. Anti-Semitism is really just the conspiracy theory where the Jews are that evil elite. I have a definition of conspiracy theory, which is a little more epistemically thick than that I use, but just to boil it down for introductory purposes. So anyway, that was it. I mean, like my interest in anti-Semitism and combating it as a sort of sub-academic activist journalist just inevitably overlapped with a necessary interest in conspiracism.
Right. And so how would you, I mean, a key question, I love the word conspiracism because I'm actually planning to use that word in the title of my next book on the JFK assassination. But how would you sort of differentiate conspiracy theory from conspiracism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a conspiracy theory, we can go over the actual definition I've composed for it, which is part of, sort of the bedrock of the project that I've undertaken. But conspiracism is distinct from a conspiracy theory or any set of conspiracy theories, in as much as, to my mind, it refers to the mindset that reflexively resorts to conspiracy theories to explain historical or social phenomena. So that's kind of how I think about that.
I mean, I use the term because in a sense, there's people who, no matter what, like in the JFK assassination, no matter what they're talking about, everything leads back to a conspiracy theory. Every fact, every factoid always leads back to some sort of conspiracy theory. Nothing, there's no such thing as a coincidence, etc. It's a very powerful concept. You want to talk a bit about conspiracy theories, and you break them down into Manichean, epistemic, magical thinking. Do you want to go into some of that?
Sure. So conspiracy theories, I mean, we can, I don't want to get too ponderous here, but we could read out the definition maybe that I've composed for it because I don't want to I don't want to do that to gratify myself. I want to do it because to me it's the bedrock
Right.
for understanding or for my approach to understanding this.
Okay.
So if you don't mind,
No.
I'll just do that
Sure.
um, and we can go from there. So the way I so the way I define a conspiracy theory is as follows. I say a conspiracy theory is a belief that a circumstance or event is a deliberate, connected, and occulted product of the timeless struggle between the forces of good and evil, attributable to the malign influence of a secret elite that supernaturally coordinates to enslave and exploit humankind, fabricates false consciousness to hide its activities, and indulges in pleasures and rites of extreme misanthropy. So that's my idea of what a conspiracy theory is. I want to start by saying that that is the holotype, right, for a conspiracy theory, which sort of like the board mountable specimen. Like if you were to go to the Smithsonian and they had a exhibit on conspiracy theories, that definition would describe the sort of reference specimen of a conspiracy theory.
Right.
So it's useful it's useful as a starting point, I think, because it covers all the bases of what composes a conspiracy theory and all of the dynamics that animate the mindset of conspiracism. But not every artifact of conspiracism that one encounters is going to represent all of that definition, right? So to give you an example, when people talk about, the advertising industry or the media brainwashing people, I call that an artifact of conspiracism because it invokes the idea of false consciousness, which is, to my mind, integral to the full idea or the holotypical definition of a conspiracy theory. So you're more likely to encounter these artifacts of conspiracism in everyday discourse or in the culture than you are to encounter, the perfect specimen of a conspiracy theory. Um, but yeah, so you asked me about the divisions. So we start there with the definition, and that's the filter through which we sort of analyze all the information that's coming in. As the information comes in and you're evaluating stuff, what's a conspiracy theory and what isn't, you begin to I feel like things anecdotally sort into three major conceptual domains that sort of make up a coherent worldview for a conspiracy theorist. The first is what I call the Manichaean domain, which more simply boils down to a kind of radical and rigid moral dualism for viewing the world as a kind of internal struggle between good and evil. It sort of is templatized by the sort of Christ versus Satan combat myth that was consolidated in Augustinian Christianity, but really it can be secularized as well. And I think you know very well, just from JFK conspiracism, that the evil elite can be modeled after many different real life reference, right? The CIA, the mafia,
Yeah,
the
military industrial
Jews,
complex.
the correct. Yeah, that's obviously a huge one. But it all sort of templatizes down to the same narrative, right? It's an evil elite that enslaves and exploits humankind through occult practices and an addiction to extreme misanthropy. The Manichaean, so this is the Manichaean domain that we're talking about. This is the sort of cosmological
You mentioned
dimension
Tucker
of
Carlson as being
conspiracism. The
another
second
example of
domain,
this.
yeah, well, so I did mention that in the introduction to the series that we're discussing, and yeah, I found there was a quote from him. If I remember correctly, he was being interviewed by a kind of a Christian Orthodox person, a fellow, some guy who had, like a podcast or whatever, and he was interviewing Tucker Carlson at his home. And Tucker Carlson claimed, it was just one part of the interview, but he claimed that he had been visited while sleeping at night in bed with his wife. He was visited by demons. who attacked him physically and left marks on his body. And it was just such a recapitulation of the Eremitic fantasies of the Desert Fathers. The early Christian Desert Fathers who would go out into the desert and wrestle with the devil, or with demons sent by the devil, in order to assert their allegiance to Christ and the upright way. It was a struggle, it was a temptation, and it was sort of an echo of this combat myth between good and evil that I saw coming out of Tucker Carlson. And in that instance, and I don't think it's the only time, I think a lot of these people, Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, and these sort of like the religious margin maybe of the broader kind of Trumpkin movement, will resort very easily to talking in demonological terms. And I think that is an artifact of this cosmological or Manichaean dimension of conspiracies. Right. Yeah. So you mentioned the other two domains. I just want to quickly, talk to them. So the epistemic domain is the second. So this refers to, and you mentioned it. You quite rightly raised the axiom that nothing is by coincidence in the context of like the JFK conspiracism, and I think that's true across the board with conspiracy theories. I think there is an epistemic approach that there's a whole mindset that follows a certain grammar, certain rules for obtaining knowledge that are contradictory to the way that people normally obtain knowledge. I call it counter knowledge, which is not a term I made up. It's a reference to a book by someone named Damian Thompson. But I sort of just lifted the title of his book, and I use it just as a general term for conspiracist epistemics, wherein there is no dialogue with reality in the conspiracist milieu. What you have is people who I don't want to be how do you say it? It's a monological context. So there's a computer scientist named Ben Goertzel who before he got in, he works with AI and he's been doing that for many years. But many years ago, his father, I think, was an academic who studied conspiracy theories, and he wrote a little monograph on conspiracism, and he identified that one of the main epistemic aspects of it is that it's a monological context in which conspiracy theorists operate. They don't have any dialogue with reality, which is a fancy way of saying that when they're given new information that may disrupt their worldview, what they tend to do is they fold it into the conspiracist imaginary that they already have. They say, well, this is just more evidence that there's a conspiracy. Is typically the move. So that's the epistemic. So there's more to it, but that's the epistemic side, is the way in which counter knowledge is acquired. And then the third is the magical realm. I think there's a study. There's a wonderful study. There's a political scientist named, I believe, Oliver Wood. There's a study that was done by these two political scientists. They showed that there was a significant predictive overlap between belief in the paranormal and belief in conspiracy theories. I found that, before I knew about that study, maybe I discovered it 4 or 5 years ago, it was always just clear to me that there was just an incredible overlap between magical thinking and the way that magic was pursued in the ancient world and in medieval times, and the way that conspiracy theorists go about trying to figure out how the evil elite is operating in the real world. So a lot of conspiracy theories, for example, they'll fixate on stuff relating to health and medicine, supplements, sexual function, the weather, crops, the crop formation thing, UFOs. There's this whole kind of paranormal, occult, magical element to it, where it's not a coincidence when Marjorie Taylor Greene talks about space lasers, like Jewish space lasers or whatever. Yep. That's a weather focused magical thought. that informs a lot of conspiracies. Chemtrails is another great example. Fluoride in the water. And that all gets back to the way, and getting back to the anti-Semitism hook. I mean, I said a lot of this is coextensive with anti-Semitism. I mean, it's no different from the way that Jews were regarded in medieval times. There's a wonderful book by Joshua Trachtenberg called The Devil and the Jews, where he talks about this sort of a three-way nexus in terms of ideation between Jews, the devil, and sorcery in the medieval imagination. And many of the conspiracist fixations on these sort of magical elements, I believe there's a through line from that to what we see today with the whole vaccine thing and countless others.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I don't know how much you follow Anna Paulina Luna, but she is this congresswoman who runs this task force on declassification. And she's held two sets of hearings on the JFK assassination with some really ridiculous authors. But if you watch her on Fox or CNN, she goes on and on about the fact that she believes in biologics, the fact that the US government has found some sort of extraterrestrial beings hidden somewhere in the US. And she also believes that all the technology we have today is from hacking extraterrestrial super technology. And I mean, it's just,
Yeah,
extraterrestrial. It's just hard to believe. In fact, she was on the Joe Rogan show a few months ago, and I mean, he asked her, "Well, are you going to look for the Ark of the Covenant?" And she said, "Well, no, I don't have to because we found it. The CIA found it many years ago, using remote viewing." Right? They put a guy in the room and they said, "Go find the Ark of the Covenant," and he found it. And she believes this.
Well, you see in that example how easily this. Yeah, I'm sorry, but you see you see how quickly it bleeds into sort of religious, context, right? I mean, it's all. I don't know who this person is, but what you're telling me, I've heard it a million times before. I don't need to know who this person is. Almost.
Yeah.
These are the stock themes: aliens, extraterrestrials, UFOs, primitive peoples who with alien origins, and then modern day people saying, either being anointed to understand this, whereas most people do not, or actually being descended from them. There's a lot of sort of racist pseudo anthropologies that tie into this kind of idea. The whole Asiatic black man thing is sort of adjacent to it. That's from the Nation of Islam, and the Moorish Science Temple. There's various new religious ideas about race and anthropology. It's a stock subset of themes. And I think it gets, and like you said, with the Ark of the Covenant, I mean, I think it just easily bleeds over into religious thought. A lot of I think that extraterrestrials in the conspiracist imagination are somewhat fungible with the idea of angels and demons. It's just sort of a secularized sci-fi way of talking about angels and demons.
Right, and I mean, there's a very prominent JFK conspiracy theorist right now who basically he was the chief writer for the Rob Reiner's series on the JFK assassination, and his Substack has now morphed into a UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon, and that's all he writes about is basically our encounters with aliens, which he considers will be exposed any day now.
Yeah, it's that gets back to the epistemic thing, right? It's like the improbability. Like nothing conspiracy this is I'm sorry. So conspiracy theorists are often labeled crazy, but they're not actually crazy. They're hyper rational to a fault, right? So they don't say things that are deductively illogical. They say things that are inductively ridiculous, right? Like the idea that the Holocaust could be a hoax is inductively silly to the point of absurdity. that there could be millions of people supernaturally coordinated to hold together a hoax that it was good enough that it would require this vanguard of exceptionally insightful people, a vanishing handful of them, to see through the cracks and see how a particular valve could not possibly have been used in this execution chamber in Auschwitz because it just hadn't been invented yet, or whatever they come up with. It gets to the epistemic part of what I try to talk about, which is they're not deductively insane. They don't say things that are impossible, like 1+1=3. They say things that are so improbable as to be wildly innumerate, right? They say things that are probabilistically so improbable that they're ridiculous. And then they try compulsively to explain their way around those incogencies.
Right. Yeah, the other thing I should tell you about is you talk about well the whole whenever when I post on conspiracy bulletin boards about some sort of facts or something that I've put up online, the standard response from a lot of people is, well, you're all part of Operation Mockingbird. Operation Mockingbird, they claim was a CIA program to basically put in place thousands of articles in the press to counter the conspiracy truth. And so I am part of Operation Mockingbird.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what I say, it all comes under the
Well, there you
rubric.
go. There's
Yeah, Operation Mockingbird.
But you see what they're doing. They're
Yeah,
invoking false consciousness there.
yeah,
They're
false
saying
consciousness.
they're saying that you are a brain.
So I get
Yep.
I get this all the time.
Yeah.
It's quite incredible. Talk a bit about, I mean, the left and the right. They both engage in conspiracy theories and conspiracism, but in slightly different ways, right?
Well, I do think so. It's not easy to give a clearly consistent account of this because there are a lot of exceptions, and I think also in this day and age, there's such a almost a nuclear fusion at this point of the ends of the horseshoe, right, where right
Yeah.
and left are coming together, and they do tend to come together in the medium of conspiracism. But yes, the general heuristic by which I differentiate between right wing and left wing conspiracy theories or conspiracism more broadly is I use the index of magic, the magical dimension that I mentioned, to differentiate them. So by and large, with right wing conspiracy theories, the element of supernatural coordination, which is one of the foundational elements of conspiracism, um, is overt, right? So you get this plain talk about the international Jewish conspiracy, or just insane LaRoucheites talking about the royal family or what have you. I mean, it's named. There's a magical sort of overtone to it, and it's unsophisticated. It's unwashed, and usually the corresponding bigotry, at least with anti-Semitism, is also just clearly unwashed. I think with left-wing conspiracy theories, the element of supernatural coordination tends to be refracted into talk of systems and structures. So yeah, so it's like instead of talking about a boardroom with 20 white men, behind a Wizard of Oz curtain pulling the strings, now you're talking about the patriarchy, or you're talking about rape culture, or you're talking about systemic racism, or you're talking about these other constructs, which I'm not saying they don't have any validity, don't get me wrong, but they do get elevated and reified to a point after a point where they can be used in a way that sort of behaves similarly to the overt statements of supernatural coordination on the right.
Yes, and by the way, a good example of that horseshoe theory of where the right and left come in is the JFK assassination, where you have the left used to say it was the CIA, and the right now says it was the CIA because they were supporting the deep state. And so
Hmm.
they both sort of agree in pointing the finger at the CIA, just for slightly
Hmm.
different reasons. And then you have Luna, let's say on the extreme right, on the MAGA right, holding these hearings, and then she'll bring in these JFK people who are on the extreme left. They all get along perfectly fine.
Why not, right? I
Yeah,
mean, you see a lot of this in the work of people like Max Blumenthal and Rania Khalek, and I don't know who the current figures are at this point because they're all so worthless that I can't bear to watch them for more than like 5 minutes. But like, there was a whole raft of these people that sort of came out of the RT milieu, where they're not really measurably right wing or left wing at this point. It's just this kind of like weird campist mentality that leans heavily into highly bigoted conspiracism, especially when Israel comes up. But also just, America and American foreign policy and everything else. I mean, it's just this weird strain of thought that is highly remunerated, I'm sure, by foreign agents.
yeah. And what do you make of like the all of a sudden out of nowhere you've got Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson. I should tell you, I mean, I have a friend of mine who is a moderate Muslim who I worked with for years in supporting Israel, bringing him in to speak to Ottawa. And all of a sudden, he's turned completely anti-Semitic. It's absolutely astounding. I mean, all of a sudden, there's like all
Hmm.
over the place, you're seeing these voices.
Two reasons, and this is a big reason why I'm doing that series. So the first reason is that the elements that make up the conspiracist narrative are fungible, right? The evil elite can be anyone that your bigoted sensibility wants it to be. Another aspect is polysemy, right? Polysemy, the idea that things don't necessarily have to mean what the text would have them say, right? So when like when people call Farrakhan out for talking about the synagogue of Satan, demonizing Jews, he typically will say something along the lines of, "I don't have anything against real Jews. It's the imposter Jews that I have a problem." And then what he's evoking is this long chain of pseudo anthropologies that I mentioned earlier, wherein in this version of it, where the black man is the original um, sort of person on Earth, and that's um, and thus seen as being the original Israelites, and so the white imposter Jew of today is an imposter, and so it's perfectly okay to make fun of those people and say terrible things about them because they're not really Jews, so words don't have the meanings that people normally ascribe to them, right? In conspiracism, like Zionism is another great example. Like Zionism at this point has ceased to mean anything like the original intended meaning of that word, I think, in most cases.
Yep.
Um, but that's it. So the purpose, you have this, the purpose of the series is to sort of detail how this came about over time, over a great expanse of time and place, so that people can understand why it's such an adaptable and plastic framework for going after the people you hate, the people you're bigoted against. I mean, you know, to me, when I mentioned earlier about the poverty of inductive logic that conspiracy theorists have, something needs to replace that, right? They have to, if they're not going to use numeracy as or likelihood as the rubric for understanding what is probable, then they have to introduce something else. And I think what they introduce is bigotry. So that's what explains why a person, maybe first half of their life, they don't have any problem with Jews. But then in the second half of their life, there's some consolation of factors. Maybe they have a bad landlord or something, and suddenly, the Jew, the Jew is the bête noire.
It just seems that we have an explosion of people who have always been okay, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they just buy into some of these incredible notions about Israel, Zionism, and the Jews.
Yeah, well, there's another aspect to it, and that's why I insist on going to such depth with the ancient history of this genealogy of symbols. It's because the original symbol in the conspiracist imaginary was the Jew. I mean, it really is, it really just comes out, in my opinion, I mean, it really just comes out of the deicide charge, more or less. And it's evolved, it's different from that, and it's more elaborate than that at this point. I mean, there's a lot of symbols that were added to it to create the modern conception. But the anti-Semitism is the proving grounds on which this body of thought was fashioned. And so what I mean there is that of course the Jew is going to be on the tip of everyone's tongue, because if you're going to get into this manner of thought, it's just a few inches away at all times.
It's true, but it is. Do you see though that? I mean, in terms, well, you show a graph where there's a rise in both conspiracism and conspiracy theories. So are we in this inevitable rise of it's going to continue to get worse over time?
Oh, well, that's a tough question. That's for social scientists. I can tell you anecdotally what I think. What I think is that conspiracism. I think it's. I can think, and this is. I'm really going off the cuff now, but conspiracism to me is both nature and nurture. I think there is a natural aspect to it, wherein again I'll allude to that political science study that was done, wherein there is an overlap in certain people who are just prone to seeing patterns and things that where there are not, or who are anxious to introduce explanations into places where of meaninglessness, right? Where there really are, where there is no meaning. You walk down the street and your dog gets run over by a bus. That's a terrible thing, and it's going to throw you into a sort of cosmic, like a state of cosmic insult. It's comforting to be able to say, well, this happened because there was
Right.
this malevolent elite, behind a curtain that made it happen because I'm part of this vanguard of super ordinary people. So you have people who want to do it for that reason, and it's their nature. But there's also a nurture part to it where where mankind, where people in general, when they're pushed to their limits. Clifford Gertz talks about this. When people are pushed to the limits of their physical endurance, when they're pushed to the limits of their analytical capacities, and when they are pushed to a point. And this was the glib example of the bus running over your dog, where they lack moral insight into something. Right, these are the three areas where people begin to sort of think magically and try to find patterns in things where there are no patterns, and meaning where there is no meaning.
Right.
And so that aspect of conspiracism can wax or wane depending on the circumstances. I think since obviously there's something wrong in America over the last 10, 20 years, however you want to date it, to bring us to the point where we're at politically and socially right now. Clearly, conspiracism is something that is growing in that milieu. But again, there's a natural part of it where there are some people who are always going to act as a substrate for this stuff, and then there's people who despair and need comfort in explanations that have a Manichaean kind of flavor to them.
Well, and by the way, you talked about your example of the forces behind the dog getting run over, and your people being in the vanguard of knowing the truth. I think of all these JFK conspiracy people who think that people have been, there's all these unnatural deaths. All these people have been murdered because of either what they know or what they're trying to find out, and then they've accumulated a list of hundreds of
Mhm.
people who have been murdered, and it's just absolutely astounding. But it's part of their, like, hey, we're part of this secret knowledge and we might be next.
Right, this is one of the most interesting parts of the conspiracist mindset is they know they're not next.
Right.
They know they're not.
Yeah.
They really believed this stuff. They'd be in a bunker,
Yeah.
in like Alaska. So there's obviously a disconnect between how they think and what they profess and what they truly understand. you
Well,
know.
and the funny part is, you like somebody like
And that's
Mark
something
Lane.
I would love to understand better.
Mark Lane would go around and say, people would ask him, well, why aren't you afraid of you being whacked next? And he would say, well, no, I'm too out there. I'm too public with this stuff, so they couldn't dare kill me.
That's where yeah, so you get the hyper rational stuff, right? Like
Yeah.
that's a sort of athletic strained rationale, you know, like, oh, and I'm sure that person uses it to kind of keep him going, keep himself going when like he flags, when he gets tired. Well, no, I need to keep going, otherwise they're going to kill me,
That's
so
right. That's true too. That's good.
yeah,
So
yeah.
what do we do? I mean, do you have any ideas on how we could fight some of this stuff?
So I do and I don't. So I despair of it. I mean, just to start with the bad news, I despair of it because I do think that it's partly natural. And I think that people are just partly like this. There's a fancy Greek word called apophenia, which people should look up. It just means the tendency to see patterns and things where there are not. And I think we're all evolutionarily hardwired to a degree in our lizard brain to do that because it's a survival mechanism. I mean, we've evolved to have this higher brain, but it's a new accoutrement, right? It's like it's this wonderful new thing, and we haven't really gotten away from the old part of the brain yet. And there's just going to be in certain people an overdetermined, overcorrective energy to find patterns in things and to believe in nefarious subtext. So I don't think that that's ever going to be true, something that we can get rid of. But the most basic, like elevator pitch, reason I can give you for writing about this stuff is I want to try to give people the information that they need so that we can so that they can understand conspiracism and so that we can promote a kind of media literacy but for life itself,
Right.
right? Like we talk about media literacy on social media and in the media in general and not believing disinformation. Well, I think we should just, conspiracism is such a huge part of all of that. I think we should just expand the endeavor to life itself. And so that's why I try to give people such a detailed and schematic idea of how this works, how it came about, um, so that together we can all work to figure out ways to promote that kind of analytical literacy for life.
So can you perhaps tell us or tell my viewers a bit about your blog where you cover this, what you've covered in the past, and where you're going, how many parts will there be in your series, and of course will there be an ultimate book in this?
Well, I would love for there to be an ultimate book in this. I do have the typical, what's the word, the tension between the skill of what I want to do and the charybdis of the money I need to make to support my family, but we'll see how that goes. Yes, the Substack that I write is basically the forum for working out my present ideas about this. There is a series that I'm writing that is the occasion for this talk that we're having. It's called Understanding Conspiracism. There's still a lot of it I need to plan out, but what I can tell you now is that there's going to be at least 6 to 10 installments of it, and they're going to be divided along in the following ways. There's already the introductory material that I've written. Then I'm going to spend 2 or 3 long form essays each on each of these rubrics or conceptual domains that I mentioned, the Manichaean one, which is what I'm doing now. And next the epistemic one, and then finally the magical one, and then there'll be some conclusory material. So it's going to be long. It's going to be probably a 2-year project, and I'm being optimistic because I'm a slow reader and I have a lot of research to do. But let's call it a 2-year project. The first main installment is out now, which you've graciously read, and that's why we're talking. And I'm going to do another 2 installments on the Manichaean part. Those are the next 2 that are coming. And then I'll do 2 to 4 on the epistemic and 2 to 4 on the magical, and then I'll do some conclusory material. So that's what that is going to be. I think at the end of all of that, if I should succeed in doing this, and I'm committed to it, then there will be a book, or at least the basis of a book.
Yeah.
I'll be trying for that. That's kind of like, on my deathbed when I'm whatever 90 whatever, and I'm looking back on my life. I want there to be a book, and this is probably the best candidate for that. But the Substack is not only this slow moving tentpole thing about conspiracism. It's also smaller posts about politics and culture today, on or about these topics. So I just did one, one prior to my tentpole piece about understanding conspiracism that occasioned this discussion. I did one about something I'm calling post-textualism, which gets to that little bit that I talked about with polysemy, the words not meaning what they apparently mean, or say them, this sort of conspiracist hermeneutics, as it were, for treating texts in ways that are weaponizable. And it doesn't get that deep into the conspiracist side of it. It just really talked about a couple of just basic examples just from everyday life. So I'm trying to, leaven the tentpole stuff with, just kind of some straightforward stuff about anti-system politics, about the Trump era, about anti-Semitism for sure. So I have another big project that I'm trying to work on with that, where I want to talk about October 7th, and the clash between, on the one hand, the traditional anti-racist sensibility and decolonial sensibility, and then on the other hand, the reality of what I think is going on with Israel and Zionism and all of that, and trying to talk about all of that in light of the Holocaust, and where there might be expropriative energies to sort of kind of, shift, or create new moral legatees of the Holocaust, while condemning Jews as sort of the inheritors of the Nazi legacy. So.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. I actually, in my next book is going to be a history of JFK conspiracy thinking, and my subtitle is From Skepticism to Conspiracism.
Yeah.
Sort of basically laying out the case. Okay, there was some initial skepticism, which was probably warranted, and then it melded into outright conspiracism as questions were answered. And I'm going to use your model. I'm going to use a lot of what you write in my conclusions, and sort of contrast
Yeah.
your definition with some real life examples from the JFK assassination. It's a very good model.
Great. I can't wait for that to come out. I will definitely be an early reader of it.
So, well, look, we'll come back to this after a couple of more parts to your series, and to follow up. But thank you very much for talking about conspiracism.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to reading your book, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Okay, thank you. Take care.